Human, explain to me why I should not consider your species an accident of evolution. The words hung in the air, cold and deliberate. Elias Vance felt every set of alien eyes in the grand lecture hall drilling into him, some curious, most amused, a few openly contemptuous. The towering figure of Professor Zalveth stood at the center, his crystalline fingers clasped behind his back, ridges of bioluminescence pulsing along his elongated skull. The Cthal professor was a legend at the Galactic Academy of Higher Thought, a master of logic, strategy, and pure deductive reasoning. And he clearly thought humans had no place here. Elias exhaled slowly, willing himself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time a professor had put him on the spot, but this felt different. This was a test. Not of knowledge, not of skill, but of worth. Zalveth raised a spindly hand. The air between them shimmered, forming a holographic construct, an intricate geometric monstrosity, shifting and twisting in impossible ways. The room darkened, the floating structure illuminating the amphitheater in eerie blue light. This, Zalveth intoned, is the Zarok configuration. A problem so complex that no sentient species has ever fully solved it. Thousands have tried. All have failed. It is a construct of perfect, unsolvable logic. You will attempt it. A murmur rippled through the audience. A few students chittered in their respective languages, some clicking, others humming, a few releasing pheromonal signals only their kind could interpret. Elias caught snippets of whispered translations. Cruel. Amusing. The human will embarrass himself. Elias swallowed hard, staring at the shifting puzzle. Then it hit him. A jolt of recognition shot through his brain. He had seen this pattern before. Not here. Not in the academy. But on Earth. No. That's impossible. And yet, he knew what he was looking at. The structure, the rotations, the interlocking sequences. It wasn't alien at all. It was familiar. Elias let out a slow breath. A Rubik's Cube. No, not exactly. This was more, bigger, deeper, a hyperdimensional extension of it. But at its core, the puzzle was the same. He bit the inside of his cheek, fighting the instinct to laugh. The Cthal, the most logical species in the known universe, had spent centuries analyzing, studying, and failing to solve something that human children played with for fun. But he couldn't just say that. No one would believe him. Do you accept the challenge, human? Zalvatha's voice was silk-wrapped steel. Elias nodded. Gladly. The professor tilted his head, clearly unprepared for such an immediate response. With a flick of his fingers, the puzzle solidified in front of Elias, its glowing surfaces hovering at chest level. You may begin. Silence. Hundreds of scholars, students, and galactic dignitaries watched, waiting for the inevitable failure. Elias didn't move immediately. He let his fingers hover over the structure, feigning deep contemplation. His mind, however, was racing. The Cthal were brilliant, no question. But their intelligence was built on rigid logic, a structured, algorithmic way of thinking. They approached problems as equations, something to be solved, step by step, within predefined rules. But humans? Humans played. And this? This was a game. He allowed himself a small smile and began. His hands moved instinctively, guiding the floating structure, rotating its segments, shifting its glowing panels. The audience leaned in, watching. Some likely expected hesitation, uncertainty, perhaps a few lucky moves before he ultimately failed. But there was no hesitation. Click. Shift. Twist. Rotate. His movements were fluid, not calculated. He wasn't thinking in numbers, he was feeling the pattern, recognizing sequences, adjusting intuitively. A soft murmur passed through the crowd. The human is progressing, too quickly. Random moves. No, look, those are patterns. He's following a structure. Elias kept his face neutral. Inside, he was grinning. The Cthal likely spent decades analyzing this thing. trying to break it down mathematically, attempting to brute force it with logic. But he had learned to solve this kind of puzzle years ago, using a mix of memorized algorithms and pattern recognition. It wasn't about numbers, it was about flow. Click. Shift. Twist. Rotate. A quarter of the puzzle locked into place. The murmurs turned into full conversations. Zalvetha's expression was unreadable. He studied Elias, his bioluminescent ridges dimming slightly, a sign of deep concern among his species. Pause. Elias stopped, looking up. The professor studied the configuration, then Elias. You claim no prior knowledge of this construct? Elias shrugged. Never seen it before in my life. Not a lie. Technically. The professor's fingers twitched. Continue. Elias resumed, faster this time. He wasn't showing off, not exactly, but he knew how this looked. The greatest minds in the galaxy had wrestled with this problem for generations, and here was a single human, solving it in real time, as if he were casually toying with it. Click. Shift. Twist. Rotate. Halfway there. The murmurs turned into outright shock. Across the hall, some scholars were frantically taking notes. Others simply stared. Zalvetha's bioluminescence pulsed erratically, his species equivalent of distress. Elias felt his heart hammering. He wasn't just proving a point anymore. This was bigger. If he finished this puzzle, he wouldn't just win the challenge. He'd shatter the Cthal's entire intellectual hierarchy. And Zalveth knew it. The professor raised a hand. Cease. Elias stopped. The puzzle floated between them, half-solved, its patterns already recognizable. Zalveth stepped forward, studying both Elias and the puzzle. You are not following a mathematical formula. Elias smiled. Nope. You are not systematically eliminating variables. Not really, no. The professor's voice was flat. Then how are you progressing? Elias turned his head slightly, as if considering. Then, he grinned. I'm playing. The silence was deafening. Somewhere in the back, an alien dropped their writing instrument. Zalvetha's fingers twitched. His expression remained blank, but the pulsing light along his skull darkened to a deep, troubled blue. You mean to say? He spoke slowly, deliberately, that this construct, one which has defied the greatest minds of the universe for centuries, is merely a game? Elias stretched his fingers. Yeah. Pretty much. Shock rippled through the room. The weight of centuries of failed attempts, endless analysis, philosophical debates, all undone by a single human who recognized a toy. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Elias saw something new on their faces. Not mockery. Not contempt. Fear. Because if this was a game to humans, what else could they do? Zalvetha's bioluminescence flickered erratically. His hand clenched behind his back. Then, he exhaled slowly. And altered the puzzle. The glowing structure expanded, fractal patterns shifting, new layers appearing. It was still the same at its core, but exponentially more difficult. Continue. Elias smirked. Gladly. A hush fell over the grand lecture hall. The glowing geometric construct before Elias Vance had changed, expanded, shifting into a multi-layered fractal nightmare, pulsing with light. The pattern still resembled the original Zarok configuration, but now new dimensions folded into existence, shifting the very logic of the puzzle. This wasn't just a harder version. It was an entirely new problem. Zalvetha's fingers twitched behind his back, the glow along his ridges flickering erratically. He had seen something that disturbed him, something unexpected, something that should not have been possible. A human, a species barely acknowledged by the galactic elite, had progressed further in minutes than the Academy's greatest minds had in centuries. But Elias barely noticed the professor anymore. His focus was locked on the puzzle. This was it. This was the real challenge. His fingers hovered over the structure. He could almost hear the murmurs around him, doubt, curiosity, disbelief, but he pushed it all away. It didn't matter. This was just a game. He moved. Click. Shift. Twist. Rotate. His hands worked faster than before. The shifting lights reflected in his eyes, the intricate layers folding in on themselves, creating new pathways. But he saw the patterns. They were harder now, deeper, but not unfamiliar. The core mechanics still resembled Rubik's Cube theory, only now applied to a higher dimensional structure. Elias's brain worked on instinct. His hands were a blur. Click. Shift. Twist. Rotate. A third of the puzzle locked into place. The room stirred. Impossible. No sentient species has ever. He's accelerating. From the corner of his vision, Elias caught Zalvetha's posture shift, just slightly, but enough. The professor was unsettled. Good. Elias kept going. Click. Shift. Twist. Rotate. Another segment aligned. Halfway done. The tension in the room thickened. Some of the scholars had abandoned their note-taking altogether, simply staring, their equivalent of jaws hanging open. Elias felt something electric in the air. Not just surprise. Not just confusion. Fear. He wasn't just solving a puzzle anymore. He was breaking something deeper. Click. Shift. Twist. Pause. Zalvetha's voice cut through the room like a blade. The puzzle froze mid-turn, suspended in the air. Elias exhaled, looking up. The professor stepped forward. His expression remained unreadable, but his bioluminescence had dimmed, a sign of deep thought in Cthal culture. You do not solve this with mathematics. Nor with pure logic. Zalveth studied him, his ridges pulsing faintly. Explain. Elias flexed his fingers. It's not about numbers, he said. It's about recognizing patterns. Feeling them. Adapting. Zalveth tilted his head. Adaptation implies randomness. Elias shook his head. No. It means intuition. Your species sees puzzles as fixed problems with a singular approach. Humans don't. We experiment. We play. Silence. The room absorbed his words, processing the implications. Zalvetha's fingers twitched. Something wasn't adding up in his mind. You claim to play. Yet, you progress. You claim intuition, yet you solve a construct that defies rational approach. His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it. A disturbance. A realization. Elias leaned in slightly. Professor, he said, keeping his voice light, almost teasing, did you ever stop to consider that this puzzle isn't actually hard? That maybe, you've just been looking at it wrong? A ripple of shock coursed through the hall. One of the scholars gasped in their native tongue. Another flicked their appendages in agitation. Even the usually composed Cthal students exchanged glances. He had just said what no one else dared to. Zalvetha's gaze narrowed. His fingers flexed. The puzzle changed again. New layers unfolded, impossible geometries twisting into place. The structure doubled in complexity, glowing veins spreading through it like a living organism. Elias felt his heart rate spike. This wasn't just an escalation. This was a trap. Zalveth had just done something illogical. Elias took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. If he hesitated, the moment would slip away. He had to own this. He cracked his knuckles. All right, he said. Round 2. And he went to work. Click. Shift. Twist. Rotate. The puzzle responded instantly, resisting him, shifting in new and unpredictable ways. Good. That made it fun. He adjusted, pivoted, found new paths. Every move Zalveth had designed to trip him up, he dodged. Where a Cthal mind would see obstacles, Elias saw opportunities. Click. Shift. Twist. Rotate. The crowd's whispers grew louder. How? He's still advancing. No species can solve this. It has no calculable solution. Elias smirked. That's why they failed. They kept looking for a formula. They never once considered that the puzzle was designed to be played. Click. Shift. Twist. Rotate. Another segment locked. Then another. Elias felt the tension shift. The Cthal scholars looked uneasy. The alien dignitaries had stopped whispering and were just staring. Some weren't even blinking. And Zalveth? His bioluminescence was flickering erratically now, his species equivalent of panic. Elias was no longer just solving a puzzle. He was rewriting the rules of the game. Click. Shift. Twist. Cease. Zalveth stepped forward, his voice snapping like a command. Elias's fingers hovered over the puzzle, inches from completing another layer. The professor studied the structure, then Elias, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the two locked eyes. Then, Zalveth spoke, voice measured. You do not think as we do. Elias tilted his head. No. We don't. Your species does not conquer problems through pure logic. You do not operate within defined structures. Elias shrugged. We adapt. The professor exhaled slowly. That is what makes you dangerous. The weight of his words settled over the hall. Some scholars visibly recoiled. Others exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't just about a puzzle anymore. It was about what humans were capable of. Zalveth studied Elias for another long moment. Then, slowly, he raised his hand. The puzzle disassembled, its glowing pieces fading into nothing. Gasps erupted around the hall. Elias blinked. That's it? Zalveth's bioluminescence pulsed dark blue, resignation. I have seen enough. Elias let out a breath. He had won. But somehow, it didn't feel like victory. Because the look in Zalveth's eyes wasn't just defeat. It was understanding. And that meant something far bigger was about to change. Silence. Not the kind that came with boredom or disinterest. The heavy kind. The dangerous kind. Elias stood at the center of it, his hands still hovering where the puzzle had been before Zalveth had erased it. He hadn't lost. He hadn't failed. The professor had simply stopped the game. And that alone said everything. The grand lecture hall was frozen in time. Hundreds of alien scholars, dignitaries, and students, beings from across the known galaxy, sat in stunned silence. The weight of what had just happened was sinking in. A human had done what no other species had ever managed. Not through brute force. Not through cold logic. Through play. And the Cthal, the most revered intellectuals in the universe, had no answer for it. Zalveth's bioluminescence pulsed in erratic waves. He was processing. Thinking. Calculating. Elias had seen that look before, on every professor who had ever been proven wrong. But this wasn't just an academic loss. This was a paradigm shift. Finally, Zalveth spoke. Human. The word was careful, measured. What you have done here today defies the very nature of our understanding. Elias tilted his head. That bad, huh? A flicker of something passed through Zalveth's ridges. Not anger. Not even frustration. Doubt. You claim your species does not approach problems as we do. That you play. Elias nodded. Yep. And yet, through this play, you have unraveled what was thought to be an unsolvable construct. Elias exhaled. Look, Professor. This was never unsolvable. It's just that no one ever looked at it the right way. More murmurs rippled through the hall. The idea itself was dangerous. Zalveth stepped forward. His voice was quiet now, almost reluctant. We Cthal do not play, human. We do not operate within chaos. Our minds function within the framework of perfect order. Structure. Logic. Our civilization was built upon these principles. We have always believed them to be superior. Elias crossed his arms. And today, you realize they're not. Zalvetha's bioluminescence dimmed, a Cthal admission of truth. Today, I have realized that they are incomplete. The tension in the room shifted. This wasn't just an acknowledgement. It was a confession. The Cthal, the greatest intellectual species in the universe, had just admitted that their way of thinking was flawed. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the assembled scholars. Some exchanged frantic glances. A few were outright horrified. Because if logic alone wasn't enough, then what did that mean for them? Elias let the moment hang, watching the reactions. He had shaken something deep. The Cthal weren't just reeling from a lost challenge. They were questioning everything. Finally, one of the alien scholars in the audience spoke. Then what does that mean for us? Zalveth turned slowly. The scholar, an elder Cthal with glowing violet ridges, looked genuinely unsettled. If logic alone is not enough, then what are we? Elias almost felt bad for them. Almost. For centuries, they had operated under the belief that logic, calculation, and order were the ultimate tools of intelligence. But today, they had seen something different. Something messy, chaotic, unpredictable. And it had worked. Zalveth took a slow breath, then turned back to Elias. Human. Tell me, his voice was quieter now, less of a demand and more of an inquiry. What is the nature of your species' intelligence? How do you define the way you think? Elias considered that for a moment. Then, he grinned. We cheat. A shockwave went through the room. Dozens of aliens gasped. Some outright recoiled. A few whispered urgently to one another, their voices rising in alarm. Zalvetha's bioluminescence flickered rapidly. Explain. Elias spread his hands. We cut corners. We break patterns. We look for the fastest, easiest way to win, not the cleanest or most logical. We don't care about solving things properly. We care about solving them first. Zalveth blinked. His mind was running through the implications. Elias leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. That's why we win. Because we don't follow the rules. Silence. And then, something strange happened. Zalveth laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even a full laugh. But the flicker of sound was unmistakable, a quiet chuckle, almost disbelieving. The entire hall stared. Cthal didn't laugh. Zalveth composed himself quickly, his bioluminescence dimming once more. But something in him had changed. You are unlike any species we have ever encountered, human. Elias smirked. Yeah. We get that a lot. Zalveth turned to the audience, his posture shifting to something firm, resolute. His next words would be recorded, analyzed, dissected for years to come. We have always believed intelligence to be a measure of structure. Of order. Of logic. He looked back at Elias. We were wrong. The hall erupted. Some scholars stood in outright protest. Others whispered furiously. A handful sat frozen, eyes locked on Elias as if seeing him for the first time. A few, a very select few, simply nodded. Because they understood. Zalveth raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. Humanity brings to this academy something no species has ever brought before. A way of thinking that defies order, yet produces results. A way of seeing problems not as equations, but as games. He turned back to Elias, his gaze unreadable. Your species does not belong here. The hall stilled. Elias tensed. Had he just been set up? Had all of this been for nothing? But then, Zalveth smiled. And yet, I find myself asking, perhaps it is the academy that does not belong to you. The silence shifted. Not rejection. Not dismissal. But understanding. Zalveth wasn't kicking Elias out. He was welcoming him in. A slow grin spread across Elias's face. He had come here expecting to be tested, mocked, underestimated. Instead, he had done something far greater. He had changed the way an entire species thought. Zalveth turned to the assembled scholars. His voice carried the weight of centuries of tradition being rewritten in real time. We must learn from them. Shock. Disbelief. But no one protested. Because they had seen it with their own eyes. Zalveth looked back at Elias one final time. Human. Teach us how to play. Elias chuckled. Gladly.